It all started innocently enough, with the typical warm welcome and playful banter that Stephen Colbert is known for. Mark Wahlberg, dressed casually and flashing his signature smile, stepped onto the stage of The Late Show, expecting the usual lighthearted chat about his latest film and fitness routines. Stephen greeted him with enthusiasm, cracking a few jokes about Boston accents and Wahlberg's past as a rapper. The audience laughed and clapped, unaware that tension was already brewing beneath the surface. As the conversation progressed, Stephen, who is known for his witty but probing questions, veered from the script. He brought up Mark's early days, but instead of the usual admiration, he questioned the actor's past controversies and how they've been handled publicly. Mark kept his composure at first, attempting to redirect the conversation back to his movie. But Stephen persisted, digging into topics Wahlberg clearly didn't want to discuss. The laughter from the audience began to taper off. Mark's facial expression changed subtly, his jaw clenched, and his answers became shorter and more clipped. Stephen, perhaps sensing a reaction, doubled down. What had started as a friendly conversation was now a simmering pot of unspoken tension. Stephen then touched on Mark's political leanings, questioning past statements the actor had made about celebrities staying out of politics. Mark tried to clarify his position, explaining that he believed in using one's platform responsibly. But Stephen interrupted with a sarcastic quip that didn't sit well with the guest. Mark's smile faded. "Are you trying to put words in my mouth?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Stephen chuckled awkwardly and replied, "Just asking what the people are thinking."
Ow.
The tension was now undeniable. The audience shifted in their seats, unsure whether to laugh or remain silent. Mark leaned forward and said, "Stephen, if you invited me here just to make me look bad, maybe you should have told me beforehand." The crowd gasped slightly. Stephen tried to steer things back, suggesting they play a quick game or jump into a fun segment, but Mark wasn't having it. "No, man. You're pushing buttons that don't need to be pushed," he said, his voice calm but firm. Colbert tried to brush it off with humor, but his attempts were starting to seem disingenuous. The energy on stage was no longer playful, it was confrontational. What had been planned as a promotional appearance had turned into a battle of control and image. The next question sealed the shift from awkward to explosive. Stephen asked about a controversial moment from Mark's past that had been resolved legally, but still haunted public perception. Mark immediately stiffened. "I'm not here to relive that," he said. Stephen replied. "But don't you think the public deserves to know where you stand now?" Mark's voice rose slightly as he responded, "I've addressed that. I've moved on. And I'm not going to let you drag it back up for ratings." The tension hit a peak. The live audience, typically roaring with laughter or applause, was now dead silent. Stephen, clearly taken aback by the intensity of Mark's pushback, tried to pivot again, but Mark leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, eyes narrowed. "You want to talk about the film, or you want to keep poking?" he asked, staring directly at Stephen. It was a moment of real television, the kind that producers dread but viewers can't stop watching. Stephen's usual control of the room was slipping. His attempts at deflection no longer landed. Even his trademark grin seemed strained. Mark Wahlberg wasn't playing the game. Stephen didn't know how to get back in control without escalating further. Stephen, perhaps feeling cornered, responded with a sharp remark about public figures needing to accept scrutiny. "Chose this life, Mark," he said. "You can't pick and choose which parts of your past are up for discussion." Mark leaned in, visibly irritated. "And you chose to be a host, not a judge?" he snapped. The crowd murmured. The verbal chess match had evolved into a direct confrontation. Stephen's face reddened slightly, his voice losing its usual smooth cadence. "I ask questions because people want answers," he said, almost defensively. Mark shook his head. "No, you ask questions to stir controversy and boost your clips online." The jab hit hard. Even Stephen's crew backstage appeared frozen. For a split second, Colbert didn't know what to say. Then he tried to laugh it off, but his tone had shifted. It wasn't a charming deflection, it was defensive. "You're really coming in hot tonight," he said. Mark replied, "You set the fire, Stephen." The audience gasped again. Tension was so thick it was practically a third guest on the stage. For the first time, Stephen Colbert looked like he might be losing the upper hand in his own show. He was uncharacteristically flustered, and Mark was not backing down. Stephen attempted one last recovery. He gestured toward the band and suggested a musical break. Mark rolled his eyes. "You're running from the heat now?" he said with a smirk. That smirk was the final straw. Stephen slammed his hand down on the desk, startling even the band. "You came here to promote a movie, not to lecture me on my job," he said, voice raised. The audience audibly reacted. Mark stood up. "I didn't come here to be ambushed," he said flatly. The two men stood facing each other across the desk like two boxers in a ring. Stephen, breathing heavily, pointed toward the guest chair. "You're free to leave if you're done." Mark stared him down. "Maybe I will." Cameras zoomed in. Producers were frantically gesturing from the sidelines, trying to get the segment cut or redirected. But the damage had been done. So whatever happened next, it was going to be etched into late-night history. Stephen tried to sit back down and recompose himself, but his usual charisma had deserted him. Mark remained standing, jaw tight, arms crossed. The war of words had crossed into full-blown clash. Mark took a slow breath and turned toward the audience. "I've been in this business for decades. I've made mistakes. I've owned them. But I won't let anyone host or not choose me as a punching bag." The audience, unsure how to respond, offered a light smattering of applause. Stephen, still seated, looked visibly stunned. He opened his mouth to respond, but paused. Something had shifted. Mark wasn't just defending himself. He was commanding the stage now. Stephen tried to regain control. "We talked to public figures about real issues here," he said. Mark turned back. "Yeah, but there's a difference between journalism and showboating," he retorted. The back and forth wasn't letting up. Every word exchanged felt heavier, each pause more loaded than the last. The air in the studio had gone from electric to volatile. Cameras kept rolling, but the planned segments were long gone. The night was now about two strong personalities unwilling to back down. Producers debated whether to cut to commercial, but they knew what they had: a viral moment unfolding live. Stephen adjusted his tie, eyes locking with Mark's again. "You done?" he asked quietly. Mark didn't answer right away. Instead, Mark looked at the audience, then back at Stephen. "I'll leave you to your show," he said calmly. Turned and started walking off stage, ignoring the calls from production staff and Colbert himself. The crowd erupted into a mix of claps, gasps, and stunned murmurs. Stephen stood up again, calling after him, "Mark, wait, let's finish this the right way." But Wahlberg didn't turn back. He walked past the curtains and disappeared into the backstage area. Stephen, now left standing alone, turned to the audience with a forced smile. Well, that was eventful. The crowd laughed nervously, unsure how to react. Stephen sat, back down, clearly shaken. The band began to play lightly, trying to shift the mood. But it was no use. The energy in the room had completely transformed. Cameras captured the moment Stephen leaned forward, burying his face in his hands briefly, before looking up and muttering, "Wow." Viewers at home flooded social media with reactions, clips, and takes. The confrontation had gone viral within minutes. The late night had never seen anything quite like it. As the show continued, Stephen did his best to resume normalcy. The next guest came out, but the atmosphere remained awkward. The elephant in the room was undeniable. Everyone, audience and staff alike, could feel it. The following morning, headlines exploded with takes on the clash. Stephen Colbert loses cool with Mark Wahlberg. Live show turns into showdown. And Wahlberg walks off late show after heated exchange trended across platforms. Mark's team released a statement suggesting the interview had not followed the agreed-upon topics. Stephen's camp responded more cautiously, expressing regret over how the exchange escalated. Critics debated who was in the right, while fans of both men defended their respective sides. But one thing was clear: the moment had captured something raw and unscripted. It wasn't just an argument, it was a rare-lived crack in the polished veneer of late-night television. Viewers weren't used to seeing Stephen rattled. That night, they saw him pushed to the edge and over. In the days that followed, speculation continued to swirl. Would Mark ever return to the show? Would Steven apologize publicly? The network aired a slightly edited version of the episode, but the uncut clips had already made their rounds online. Behind the scenes, sources hinted that producers were caught off guard and scrambling to contain the fallout. Mark went on another show days later and briefly addressed the clash, saying, "I stand by what I said. I won't let anyone paint a false picture of me." Steven, meanwhile, opened his next episode with a cryptic joke. "Well, I guess I should cancel my boxing lessons?" The audience laughed, but the message was mixed. Steven attempted one last recovery. He gestured toward the band and suggested they take a quick musical break to cool things down, trying to inject levity into a situation that had already spiraled beyond control. Mark, however, wasn't interested in playing along anymore. Gave a sharp laugh and leaned into the microphone. "You're running now?" he said, his voice filled with restrained sarcasm. "First you poke and prod, and now that I've pushed back, you're reaching for the piano." The audience, caught between entertainment and unease, let out a collective murmur. Steven sat upright, clearly taken aback. His usual confident smirk was now replaced with a slight grimace. "Mark, come on. It's a comedy show," he said, waving his hand dismissively. Mark responded without hesitation, "No, it's a setup. And you're not even hiding it well." That hit hard. Steven's face flushed, and his eyes narrowed, just enough to betray his frustration. "He came here to promote a movie," he snapped, "not to lecture me on how to host my own show." The energy in the room turned electric, charged with the unmistakable tension of two powerful egos colliding. Mark stood up slowly, his hands on the arms of the chair, eyes locked on Colbert. "And you invited me here to play the villain, didn't you?" he asked, his tone challenging. "You don't care about the work, the project, or the truth. You just want a moment you can clip and trend." That accusation, whether fair or not, landed with a thud. The crowd gasped. Some even clapped nervously as Steven rose from his chair as well. "I'm not here for clicks, Mark. I'm here for conversation, but if you want to walk out, go ahead." Mark stared him down for a few seconds longer before replying, "Maybe I will." The room was silent. Even the band had stopped playing. The tension had gone from theatrical to genuinely uncomfortable. Camera operators shifted angles, unsure whether to zoom in or pan out. Producers backstage were reportedly scrambling too, decide whether to cut the feed or let it roll. But it was too late to contain the eruption. Steven and Mark were now standing toe-to-toe, no longer playing host and guest, but two men in the middle of a very real clash. One felt ambushed, the other disrespected, and both were too proud to be the first to back down. Steven gestured toward the exit. "Door's right there," he said coldly. Mark raised his eyebrows and replied, "Good to know." But he didn't move, not yet. He looked out into the audience, scanning the stunned faces. "This is what happens when truth makes people uncomfortable," he said softly. The live tension reached its boiling point. Neither man said another word, and the standoff held for what felt like an eternity until one of them finally broke the silence.